All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I think we're going to still have a couple of people trickling in. I apologize if you hear some background barn noise. My office is in a barn and we have quite the full house right now. My name's Allison Bremer. I'm an advisory board member of the New England Fed and the community outreach coordinator here at the MSPCA in Methuen. If you'd like and feel comfortable, go ahead and drop your name and your organization position state in the comments so we can all get to know each other a little bit better. I would like to take just a moment to say thank you to some of our webinar sponsors. That's going to be Connecticut Humane Societies, the MSPCA, Best Friends, Pet Finder, and NACA. And thank you to our possum partners, Save One Soul Animal Rescue. Just a couple dates worth noting. Next month on February 11th at 11 a.m., we have another FEDucation webinar. It's the ASV Guidelines for Small Animal Medical in the Shelter. So go ahead and give that a register. It should be up on our website, or you'll get an email reminder for that. Also save the date. Our 2026 annual training conference is coming up in March from the 16th to the 18th. That's going to be in Portland, Maine. And of course, stay tuned for other news on our, upcoming webinars. We'll also be doing our in-person training sessions again coming back in September. I'm going to go ahead and drop a link for our website in the chat, as well as a link to our Etsy shop. We've got some merch and gear if that so interests you. And now we're going to go on to our main event. We have Dr. Sarah Hicks here with the she's an outreach veterinarian and clinical instructor at University of Wisconsin Shelter Medicine program. And we're really excited to see her today. If you have any questions, I'm going to ask that you go ahead and drop them in the chat. I'll be moderating that and we'll do a little Q&A at the end of the presentation. All right, thank you guys. And I'll stop sharing my screen so that Sarah can.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me pretty well? Hopefully so. Hopefully so. Okay, can everyone see the screen? It should have two adorable little bunnies on it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for putting that in the chat. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat too much throughout the presentation, but I think we'll probably collect some questions in the chat and leave time for questions at the end of the session. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off just to preserve some bandwidth, and let me know if you have any trouble hearing me at any point. But let's hop to it, as the presentation says. So today we're going to be talking about putting the Association of Shelter Veterinarians guidelines for rabbit housing into practice. This is a relatively new document, and a lot of organizations still haven't had an opportunity to hear about it. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, and we're also going to talk about the kind of practical implications of these guidelines for you. Like was mentioned in the introduction, I'm Sarah Hicks. I'm an outreach veterinarian and clinical instructor for the University of Wisconsin's Shelter Medicine program. You will come to find throughout the presentation, though, that I'm not from Wisconsin. I have a nice, strong Southern accent. I live and work remotely out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is my home. So let's get to it. I just want to take a moment to talk about our program and how we work to support the work that you do. There might be quite a few of you who haven't interacted with our program before. We're in Wisconsin, and there are many shelter programs that might be geographically closer to you that you've worked with. But we work with folks all over the country, in the world, including those that are in the Northeast. And we have lots of ways that we're able to help support the work of animal welfare organizations and shelters. So we do that through consult requests, so anything from infectious disease to facility design advice. You can find us on social media. We have an online library, which is shared with the UC Davis Currett Shelter Medicine program. We have a veterinary fellowship that helps support veterinarians that are working in animal welfare and shelter spaces. And And if you are specifically interested in receiving the information from these slides that we're talking through today, I'll be sending out a PDF of the slide deck to the organizers of this time today. So you'll have access to that. And this is why I'm here specifically. So I was fortunate enough to aid in the creation of these new guidelines. The Association of Shelter Veterinarian Guidelines for Humane Rabbit Housing and Animal Shelters. And they were published not too long ago, just a few months ago, in the Journal of Shelter Medicine and Community and Animal Health. But before we get into the more kind of granular details and the practical implications of this publication, I think it's important to give a little background on the how and the why it was created. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how the new rabbit housing guidelines came about, the process that went into creating them, and then we'll go over some of the basic recommendations in the guidelines. It would take hours to go through everything. Unfortunately, we just don't have to do that because this document is open access to anybody who wants it. So this is just going to be an overview with a brief moment to really focus on a few of the big pieces of the document, the primary enclosure section, and we'll spend a little bit of time in the co-housing section as well, because those are really kind of newer concepts or less familiar concepts, and really important to these recommendations. So this all started when a group of shelter veterinary medicine experts were kind of discussing the like what's next of our work. What are projects that we feel like we need to work on, stones that have been left unturned. We talked about it, we'd made a lot of pretty amazing progress with animals like cats in shelters. So we've got portals, and not too many cats are still being housed in like little 2x2 squatty kennels, and advances have really been made. But when we're going into shelters, the rabbits are seemingly pretty underserved. Shelters often have a lot of them, they stay for a long time. And we knew that shelters also weren't really equipped to meet the needs of rabbits. And even if they were equipped to potentially meet the needs of those rabbits, they might not know how to do so, since the amount of readily available information on housing rabbits in shelters is pretty low. So in March of 2022, a group was formed and we committed to working on creating some guidelines for housing of rabbits in shelters. So this is us. Um, and I want to acknowledge that this is by no means a list of rabbit experts. There were there was various experience amongst us with working with rabbits, and there was lots of learning along the way for all of us. But this is a group of people who, one, have quite a bit of shelter experience. So you might recognize some pretty famous names up there, Dr. Hurley, Dr. Berliner, to name a couple. And two, it's a group of people who've been given ample opportunities to observe how housing and shelters affects well-being of many species, not just rabbits. And we've committed to making that wider known and better understood in our work. So on our journey, we realized there is a whole lot we do not know about rabbits. It started with kind of a comprehensive literature review on topics related to housing of rabbits in shelters and other confinement settings like laboratories, like meat and fur farms. And there was very little information in the academic literature about housing pet rabbits. So then our section leads, our group, we created recommendations in sections, which were then reviewed by the group as a whole. And we took evidence from and we made some best guesses based on the natural history of wild rabbits, from laboratory and farmed rabbits and husbandry research. We extrapolated some information from other species, Um, and we took plenty of information from practice, from anecdotes of those who've worked with rabbits. And then we recruited subject matter experts to review and comment on those recommendations. And whenever possible, you'll see that recommendations are supported by published references on rabbit housing and rabbit behavior. But again, there's a lot we don't know. And so we really had to kind of collect a great deal of information to start to make sense and make something valuable out of this. Okay. We knew we were up against some long-standing norms for housing of rabbits. Additionally, stressed rabbits are kind of like stressed cats, right? They don't always look stressed to the untrained eye. Stress tends to look like doing less, not doing more. And so it took some digging into what better or even what good could look like for shelter house rabbits. What were we looking for them to be able to do and show us? In order to understand the rabbits we care for, it's helpful to start at the beginning. So where did they come from? Our domestic rabbits all descended from European wild rabbits. So that might be different than the understanding that a lot of us had. I know this was a piece of information that was new to me, that our domestic rabbits come from European rabbits. They don't come from the domestication of like the cottontail in North America. But we now have over 305 breeds of domestic rabbits in about 70 countries, and there are estimated to be 3 to 7 million pet rabbits. What a range, right? In the United States alone, and about 1 million in the UK, where rabbits are a commonly found pet. Domestication of rabbits from their wild counterparts is a relatively recent event when we talk about the timeline of domestication in animals. Um, and selection of breeding for rabbits has historically been focused more on fur and meat production than for the tameness or enjoyment of handling that we might see for other companion animals. Indoor and confinement type housing is also relatively new for this species. So, as recently as a few hundred years ago, most domestic rabbits were raised in these outdoor warrens. And given this history, the behavioral needs of rabbits are really more similar to their wild counterparts than is the case for other common species that we're dealing with in shelters like dogs and cats. European wild rabbits, they live in social groups. They're most active at dusk and dawn and at nighttime, and they spend about 30 to 70% of their time foraging, and their home range can be up to about 50 acres. So they cover a wide amount of space. So kind of as we go through this understanding of what rabbits do in the wild, it becomes pretty apparent that what we often offer them from a domestication standpoint could be quite lacking. All right, rabbits are a prey species, and thus they have these survival strategies that we have to take into account. They want to be and need to be hard to find. They have keen senses and they need to be able to pay attention to their environment. So they have to be given the opportunity to assess their surroundings, to be sentinels, to protect themselves and the others in the group. And if they detect something, they need the ability to escape, to run and to hide. And rabbits will fight as a last resort, but know that that's kind of a last resort behavior for them. So when we look at these pictures, we start to get an understanding of like, what are we missing in the care we provide for these rabbits? Rabbits are the third most common pet species, um, and often the third most common animal that's seen in certain shelters, but shelters are not the first place most people are looking to get a rabbit. That's not been a traditional source of pet rabbits. And in some shelters, it actually may be harder to adopt a rabbit than a dog or cat. Most shelters were built for dogs and cats, and sometimes not even built to meet the needs of those dogs and cats, without much consideration given for rabbits and without much consideration given for a lot of other species. So, given the challenges in providing humane housing in shelters, rabbits are often better served by housing outside the shelter whenever it's possible, whether that's through foster care or adoptive housing or exploring opportunities outside of shelter intake. But we know there will be times when rabbits must be admitted despite our best efforts. And in those cases, attention to the overall environmental conditions, the location that they are in our care, the size, the setup, the primary enclosure and enrichment spaces, and strategies to safely meet the social needs of rabbits, that all helps rabbits stay happy and healthy. Shelters that have rabbits have several challenges facing them. So we know as shelter folks that confinement is inherently stressful for many animals. It can cause illness, it can cause poor well-being. We're often limited in space, so the housing we can provide isn't as big as we'd like it to be. And going back to those natural behaviors and the things we know about wild rabbits, we know that we're not likely to be able to provide acreage to these rabbits. Um, we know that the size we offer to them and the housing we offer them impacts our cleaning practices, the disease risk, and it can even impact adoption um, if we're not showcasing those rabbits the way that they could be shown. There's also shelter data that leads us to believe that for many shelters, rabbits tend to stay longer than dogs and cats do. And so I'm not monitoring the chat right now, but I'd love to get some feedback from the attendees on this call. If your own shelter data or your observations would suggest the same thing, that rabbits tend to stay longer than other animals in your shelter. So feel free to drop that in there if you're able. So given these challenges, we need kind of a framework on which to base our recommendations. Now, if you're familiar with the ASV guidelines for standards of care in animal shelters, this graphic probably looks familiar, except now it's a little picture of a rabbit instead of a dog or cat. Adequate housing has to be able to provide, at minimum, the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. And for anybody who's been in animal welfare for some time, you probably have these memorized. You might have had them framed on your wall. But that ensures that animals have the opportunity to eat and drink normally. They're protected from pain, disease, injury. They're not unduly subject to fear or distress, and they're comfortable and able to express normal species-specific behaviors. In essence, the 5 freedoms aim to minimize negative impacts, right? But the 5 domains model expands on the 5 freedoms so that we can define positive mental states that are supported by an enriched environment versus merely minimizing negative impacts. So, in other words, what we've come to recognize is that the absence of something bad isn't necessarily the presence of something good, right? So this is a direct quote from the guidelines. The housing model presented in shelters also has the potential to exert an influence in the surrounding community. Thus, the consequences of getting shelter housing right can be profound for animals and people alike, while poor housing can be costly and stressful at best and deadly at worst, right? And we know that for other species too, right? So you see that first picture, housing unit number one, and then other possibilities, right? Okay, so before we start into the section specifically, I just want to show how rabbits move. This was one of the biggest kind of moments for all of us is looking at just watching videos of rabbit behavior. And it took a minute to load up a minute ago. So I think for a lot of us who hadn't owned pet rabbits, the sheer amount of space that they seemed to need, their activity level really was enlightening as we went through this. Okay, so let's talk about a few big picture things we need to take into consideration when housing rabbits in our shelter. So number one, we want to have we house some very loud and sometimes very smelly predators in most of our shelters, and rabbits are, again, a prey species. Just like with housing dogs and cats, we want rabbits to be able to express their natural behaviors in care, which is why it's so important to learn about rabbit behavior, hence that very important video I just showed. Um, we can't meet their behavioral needs if we don't know what those behavioral needs look like. We want to reduce stress while at the same time making and
Ooh, Sarah, I think you're cutting out a little bit.
any section of choice to change their.
Dr. Sarah, we can't hear you.
Oh no,
Yeah, you're just cutting in and out
yeah.
a little bit.
Can you hear me at all right now?
Yes, we just heard every word you just said, but we missed a little
Okay.
bit of the last slide.
Okay.
And now we hear nothing. What's happened? Just bear with us, everybody. I think we're having a little bit of an audio issue. We've got nothing at all from you right now, Dr. Sarah. All right, everybody, just give us a minute. Dr. Sarah's going to be right back. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. Taryn, I did see your question in the Q&A, so it will not go unaddressed.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you good now.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's all
Oh,
right.
gracious.
It's like, yeah, internet problems.
Yep.
All right.
Um, okay, so tell me what was
So
the
the last
last.
slide, yeah, the last slide you had up was the lighting slide, but I think if you could go to the one right before it and just
Okay.
kind of touch on those things, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And go ahead and share your screen when you're ready.
Yes, will do. Will do. Okay. I apologize for that. Hopefully we didn't.
You just cut out again. I don't.
Oh no. Okay.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Okay. Here we go. Just give me one more second. I'm so sorry. Find where we were. Okay. Are you all able to hear me pretty well now?
Yes, you're coming through nice and clear.
Okay. Okay. So really the last thing I kind of ended up talking about was just the importance of choice and giving animals choice in their environment to change some of the things that they do have the ability to change. And are you seeing the slide okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Okay. So I know I found it interesting to learn how little light rabbits actually need, but when you think about their behaviors, it really starts to become clear what they prefer and why they need so little light. So rabbits are burrowing animals that tend to be less active during full daylight. So constant exposure to bright lighting is actually stressful to them. But that being said, humans need to be able to monitor the animals and clean their enclosures, and adopters need to be able to view the animals. So the light recommendations we provide are as much about us being able to perform the tasks we need to perform and make observations we need to make. So we can accomplish this variation through the use of dimmable lighting when possible that can be turned up and down during active cleaning and care, and then turned down to lower levels and simulate what rabbits might normally experience during the rest of the daylight hours. Ensuring that rabbits have sufficient darkness is also super important. So lights need to be turned off at night. Um, Use a timer if you're able to, or if that's needed. And of course, we want to have opportunities for the animals to avoid light when they want to. And that can be managed within the enclosures we develop for them. So, a darkened hiding box, for example, can really do a lot of good for these rabbits that would be likely burrowing down in the middle of the day. Noise control. So rabbits have very sensitive hearing. Like us, they can hear low frequencies, low pitch, but they also can hear ultrasonic frequencies or high pitch and low volume sounds beyond what humans can hear. So we know that noise exposure can have negative effects on health and behavior, including changes in their endocrine and cardiovascular and GI and neurologic system, their sleep-wake cycles, even wound healing. And we can see a variety of behavioral changes from excess noise. So, this is something we really need to care about. If something is loud to us, it is really loud to a rabbit. So, shelters should consider this when they're housing rabbits, making effort to house them in quiet spaces, away from areas with lots of activity or movement, utilizing or retrofitting cages with quiet latches can really help. So this next slide shows some DIY options for using something like heat shrinking tubing. It's an example of a quick but impactful noise reduction hack, and it's wonderful for everybody in your shelter, not just rabbits. Additionally, we can use other strategies to reduce noise for other animals, like barking, for example. So we can use things like treat buckets on dog kennels, um, and we can train caretakers to be mindful of the noise they make when they are providing care. Now let's talk about air quality. So rabbits have an excellent sense of smell, not quite as good as the dog, but way better than ours. So we're talking 100 million olfactory cells compared to 30 million in humans, compared to 250 million olfactory cells in dogs. So smell plays an important role in helping rabbits evade predators, and in social communication with other rabbits. So whenever possible, we want to avoid cycling air from areas that house predator species, so dogs, cats, into areas that are housing rabbits. We also want to make sure that good ventilation is present, but we need to limit the exposure to drafts. So this can be done by thoughtful placement of the enclosures within the space. And for rabbits housed outside, we want to be sure to provide a shelter to protect them from wind and other weather elements. So good ventilation in combination with things like spot cleaning will limit the buildup of noxious gases, of harmful materials. And when we clean, we need to be sure that we're not stirring up dust or hay or litter, as rabbits are really sensitive to these things, and these create a little assault on their respiratory tracts. This chart is directly from the guidelines, so it shows the rabbit's comfort zone for temperature, humidity, ventilation. One of the biggest takeaways here is that rabbits aren't generally fans of super hot temperatures. So in general, they can tolerate cold as long as they're given adequate nutrition, as well as housing and furnishings that help them thermoregulate. So like a hiding box with deep hay or bedding and protection from drafts. When it's warm, rabbits should be given shade and smooth, uncovered flooring with space to stretch and help them dissipate their body heat, and access to wet surfaces or cooled tiles, chew-proof cooling pads, air conditioning. And even though rabbits can tolerate a range of temperatures, there's also a need to consider like rapid or large temperature fluctuations that are stressful and can cause immune suppression for these rabbits. So we've already touched on this again, but as rabbits are prey species, it's important that the housing be located away from the sight, sound, smell of predator species. Whether or not a shelter chooses to house rabbits outdoors depends a lot on the weather of that outdoor setting. So if we're going to house rabbits outside, we have to keep in mind the following. They need protection from extreme weather and climate conditions. Even if they have been outside a great amount before they come to us, they put into place provisions that protect them. So we have to make sure that we can still provide that for them. So we have to provide access to shade at all times. Remember, rabbits don't tolerate heat very well in general, so we need to be sure they are able to cool down. If temperatures are below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or it's a lot colder than the rabbit is used to, then they need an insulated shelter or opportunities for external heating. We want to be sure the outdoor spaces are free of toxic plants, fertilizers, mold, pesticides, toxic materials. And then also in areas with known rabbit hemorrhagic disease, which in my understanding, the Northeast is not a hot area for that. But for those areas that do have that disease concern, we want to prevent contact between our rabbits or wild rabbits. And that includes forages or browse that can be contaminated. We have lots and lots of information in these guidelines about how rabbit hemorrhagic disease and other diseases need to be considered in the context of housing. We also need to ensure that our outdoor enclosures are protected from predators, which can be challenging depending on where you are. So the use of enclosure covers, buried wire fencing, secure latches, and super sturdy enclosure materials are all things that have to be considered. So here are a few examples of outdoor rabbit housing. The Rabbit Welfare Association and Fund website has a lot of good information on specifics regarding outdoor housing. In other countries, outdoor rabbit housing is quite common, or is considered the best option for rabbits. I also want to briefly mention offsite housing. So, with the exception of short pop-up, like adoption type events, any offsite housing or placement in foster homes needs to meet or exceed the standards that we lay out in these guidelines. So let's get into the primary enclosures themselves and dive a little bit more deeply into the details. So we know already most shelters are insufficient to meet rabbits' needs. We need to serve as a model for adopters. We need to allow for choice. And animals in shelters typically have very little choice and little control over almost everything. So they don't know when the lights will come on and off. They don't know what they'll get to eat, when they'll get to eat. So, if we think about housing, what are some choices we can offer to animals in our care? We can offer them the choice to be hidden or visible, to rest on the floor or on an elevated platform, to sleep away from their litter boxes, to rest on a cool surface versus a warm, fluffy one. There are quite a few things we can do when we actually think about it. A complete primary enclosure for a rabbit consists of four main areas. So there's a resting, hiding space, an elimination area, eating, drinking area, and exercise and play space. When we were creating these guidelines, we spent a ton of time investigating the best way to determine how big the primary enclosure should be. We looked at what else was out there, and unfortunately, most of what we could find in the US in particular was for rabbits that are used in labs or farmed for meat or fur. But the RSPCA in the UK has pretty excellent guidelines for housing rabbits in their shelters. And so we looked at that too. But ultimately, we decided that an outcomes based assessment would be most helpful, which means that we base the enclosure size on what we want the rabbit to be able to do in the enclosure. So we want them to be able to do a few things. We want them to be able to rest fully outstretched without touching the walls, without touching other rabbits. We want them to be able to turn around unimpeded, stand up on their hind legs, without their ears being smushed into the ceiling. We want them to be able to move after being startled without immediately hitting a wall or a barrier. And we want them to be able to take some hops. And we decided on 3 consecutive unimpeded hops as a guideline for activity. Depending on body size, the length of a hop can be up to about 2.3 feet. Or longer if startled. And in case you were wondering, and I know you all were, what the longest hop recorded for a rabbit is, and it's about 9.88 feet. And that's held by a Swedish rabbit named Dobby. So these are the terms we landed on for our recommendations. We know that for most shelters, it'll take time and planning and fundraising to provide rabbits in shelters with enclosures that really meet their needs. But we also know that even small incremental changes can have a meaningful effect on welfare. So think about the last time you gave a cat a hiding spot in a shelter. It's simple, right? But it makes such a huge impact. But for space dimensions, we offer a couple of options. So we offer a minimum recommended dimension, and those are for if you have the space for the rabbit to have their exercise area included in their enclosure. Below that, we have the minimum acceptable dimensions that we lay out. And that refers to an enclosure that doesn't have the exercise space built in. Rabbits housed in enclosures that are of minimal acceptable dimension need to be given access to exercise space for several hours each day. The best choice is to decrease the length of stay for these rabbits and get them out to adoptive homes or foster homes, or rescue organizations. If they need to stay in the shelter, we want organizations to work towards improved housing. And we know it won't happen overnight, but that's okay. So let's take a look at the actual dimensions we're talking about. So this is straight out of the guidelines. We've given dimensions for both single and pair rabbit housing, in the minimum recommended and the minimum acceptable dimensions. So for a single rabbit, they should have an enclosure of at least 33 square feet, with one side being at least 9 to 10 feet long. And this should let them accomplish that 3 consecutive hops we talked about earlier. If there's a pair of rabbits, the size goes up. If rabbits are housed in enclosures of the minimum acceptable size, there are a few caveats here. They have to be given access to an exercise area that meets the minimum acceptable or the minimum recommended enclosure size so that they can carry out those behaviors. And they have to be given access to that exercise area every day. If the rabbit needs more than 2 weeks and is staying in the shelter more than 2 weeks, they need to move into a place where they have larger housing. And it's important to note that even the minimum recommended enclosure size of about 33 to 45 square feet doesn't really adequately meet the recommendations for rabbits living in pets in homes. But this really substantially increases the well-being of rabbits in shelters. And then as far as a vertical dimension is concerned, the minimum recommended wall height for rabbits that we suggest, especially for rabbits that aren't being supervised, is about 4.1 feet, even though some rabbits can jump out of that. So you have to contextualize the rabbit enclosure for the individual rabbit. So here's an image of a rabbit enclosure example, again from the guidelines, with those important elements included here. Rabbits, when they're given the choice, prefer to move more near dusk and dawn. So midday is the least active time of day for rabbits. So we should aim to provide access to exercise areas, especially if you're using those minimum acceptable dimensions during those times that they'll be active. So again, we really encourage shelters to move towards those recommended dimensions because not only is it better for the rabbits, but think about the logistics of moving rabbits into exercise spaces at the time that they are most likely to benefit from it. That is challenging. So there's a little video here. I'm hoping it'll come through. We know that rabbits that have more space are more likely to be rabbit-like. Okay, so how many of you knew that this is what a pet rabbit can really be like? I did not. Um, this was such a surprise to some of us. Laura Dixon demonstrated that rabbits were generally more active and interacted more with environmental resources in larger pens compared with smaller ones in a study that she did. Not surprisingly, but important to consider when we think about what our adopters see when they view rabbits in the shelter. Like, again, are we showcasing them in a way that's going to help them get into homes more quickly? Okay. Moving on to primary enclosure materials. Most of this is kind of common sense, like non-toxic and no sharp edges. But note that if you're housing rabbits outdoors, you need to keep the rabbits in and the predators out, which can require some extra protections like using strong wire fencing, which is buried 1 to 2 feet deep underground, depending on the rabbit and depending on the predators. And ideally, it's shaped like an L. So even if predators are persistent enough to dig down, they won't necessarily be able to just pop up on the other side. And it's of note that chicken wire is not really strong enough for these enclosures. You need something very secure. Oh no, my presenter view went away. Sorry. Just not having a technologically nice day, I think. Sorry, give me just 1 second and I'll get back down to where we need to be. Good thing y'all are such a tolerant group of folks. Okay. Okay. Flooring and bedding. That provides several things for rabbits. So it provides them a space to rest, it provides traction for movement in the enclosure, and it provides enrichment and it can help with thermoregulation, either through cooling or through the provision of warmth. It's important to note here wire flooring is really considered a no-no due to the risk of pododermatitis and injury. So if you absolutely have to use it, it needs to be securely covered with a safe material. We also want to generally avoid slippery surfaces because those can cause injury in rabbits, and rabbits might be kind of hesitant to move around in them. Litter boxes, we'll rush through this, but they need to be cleanable. They need to be big enough to accommodate the rabbit. We need one per rabbit or more. The corner or the periphery of the enclosure is preferred placement for these rabbits, but not the triangular corner litter boxes. Those are usually too small. Um, and then one of the things that's different for rabbits than dogs and cats is rabbits usually don't mind eating where they eliminate. So hay should be offered in or near the litter box, like in a hay rack above the litter box. Similar to litter boxes for cats, the boxes need to be big enough, like I said, to allow for all these things to happen. And another image that we include in the guidelines is kind of how to set up a good rabbit-friendly litter box. And that's included as that graphic that you see. Moving on to enrichment. It's important for all animals in the shelter, but it becomes even more critical as length of stay increases, right? So rabbits that are provided with enrichment show fewer abnormal behaviors and fewer health problems than rabbits without enrichment. The best enrichment options for rabbits include things that are based on their natural behaviors. So they need to be able to dig, they need to be able to perch, play, chew, and hide. Some rabbits also love to be up high. One article noted preference of rabbits to be on platforms above 6.5 feet off the ground. That's not obtainable for all of us, but it's something we want to be able to offer for them to be up higher than ground level. Another type of enrichment can be in the form of companionship, though this has to be done carefully, and we have a little more to come on that. As mentioned when we were going over the floor space chart, if the primary enclosure can't meet all the needs, so if it's in that minimum acceptable range but not in the recommended range, a secondary space must be provided to allow for exercise and play. These exercise enclosures should provide plenty of space for rabbits to run and jump and make quick changes in direction. They need to include things like hay and water in a hiding space and a litter box, as well as enrichment items such as toys and gnawing items and platforms. So often these spaces are created by attaching multiple X pins, exercise pins to each other, but it's just important to note that wire pins are commonly only about 3 feet tall. So you may find that placing a fitted bed sheet over the top of the pin might help escape when there are rabbits that are tempted to do that. And while it might be tempting, if you have a lot of rabbits that need to get out for their daily exercise, please don't mix rabbits that haven't had a lot of consideration for co-housing or co-mixing. So here's an example of an enrichment space provided by San Diego Humane Society, and that's a volunteer providing some exercise time. You might notice that there are a few elements kind of missing from what we just talked about, but this is a start again. Okay, we're going to move on to co-housing. The guidelines authors spent a lot of hours researching and discussing co-housing of rabbits in shelters. So on the one hand, we knew or we learned that rabbits are super social and like to be with other rabbits. There are a lot of benefits rabbits get from having a buddy, and single housing can lead to abnormal behaviors like excessive wall pawing or digging or bar chewing. But on the other hand, most of us have kind of seen or repaired some pretty gnarly wounds from co-house rabbits that have gotten into fights. Rabbits will fight, especially during times of stress. So we discussed at length things like how long does a rabbit need to be in a shelter to make it worth the risk of trying to bond them with another rabbit? And are there other types of risks to co-housing rabbits aside from just physical risks? So we provide an explanation of the factors we believe are important for co-housing rabbits, but we also provide a bit of a flow chart, kind of an algorithm to help walk shelters through that decision making. For shelters that have elected to co-house rabbits, it's important to have a variety of housing options for pairs, for trios, for singles that allow for separation when needed. So when given the choice, so plenty of space, co-house rabbits tend to spend about 2 to 5 body lengths apart some of the time. Looking back to our outcomes-based assessment, we want co-house rabbits to be able to perform all the same behaviors at the same time without competing for space or resources. So that's why you see those spaces and resource requirements go up. So for each rabbit, for example, they should have at least one hiding space. They should have a platform, a water source, a toy, an enrichment item. When bonding and co-housing is not possible or practical, we want to offer the enrichment of some social contact, even if it's not co-housing. So we can use barriers like baby gates or pens between rabbits that are safe to have contact. We also just want to consider the individual factors like disease risk or likelihood of fighting behavior. So a physical exam can go a long way. Understanding the risk of things like rabbit hemorrhagic disease can go a long way here. A general recommendation is not to co-house intact adult rabbits. Those are the rabbits in which we see the most fighting type behavior. Age matters. So amicable relationships might be more feasible in rabbits that are under about 5 months of age, and fighting under 12 weeks of age is pretty uncommon. Where co-housing or where opportunities to interact with other rabbits is not an option, human companionship can be used, can be substituted on the rabbit's terms, of course, but we need a lot of company to replace a housemate. I'm going to kind of speed through these last few slides because I know we're running out of time. But we also want to ensure that um, length of stay is taken into consideration. Rabbits that are paired in shelters may have a longer length of stay than rabbits that are singly housed. So it takes some consideration of whether you're going to choose to co-house rabbits in the interest of keeping their length of stay as short as possible. And I'm going to skip through this and just show that there's a lot to consider. So we have included a should we co-house rabbits in our shelter flow chart to help shelters kind of work through those considerations. Just a few words about special populations of rabbits, like pregnant nursing baby rabbits, senior rabbits, geriatric rabbits, surgical patients, rabbits from overwhelmed caretaker situations. Um, Whether it's due to their life stage or their medical or behavioral needs, there are additional guidelines for things they may need that we need to take into consideration for them, and we detail that in the guidelines. And then there are a couple of sections of the guidelines we didn't touch on today. So sanitation, infectious disease management, I didn't talk about as it relates. Those sections are created to relate to housing. They are not standalone sections about disease management specifically. But I think those sections, one, the infectious disease section is quite detailed. And so it could be in its presentation all by itself, but also I think they're going to feel more familiar to people. So many of our sanitation considerations and even infectious disease considerations are similar to the things we think about in dogs and cats, with some notable things about rabbits, like considerations for rabbit hemorrhagic disease. There's a lot of information in this document. Um, but we are available to organizations and people if they have questions. And so I know this is all a lot to take in. Um, but just remember, it's not all or nothing. We want you to do what you can. We want you to improve on what you have. And we want to provide care outside of the shelter whenever that's possible. Um, but if you have the opportunity, if you're considering a remodel, a build well would be our advice. Because if rabbits are going to continue to be such a prominent species in shelters, we need to ensure that we set up a better future for them going forward. And I'll close with just this inspirational slash aspirational video of rabbit housing at one of the RSPCA branches. Um, and I believe the sound doesn't come through for that video for you all. And so I'll just let it continue to play and we can get to some questions if we have time. I know I went right up next to the wire, didn't I?
Yeah, but I mean, I'll have to say, like, I definitely had some takeaways there. This was really informative. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. That was really fantastic. We do have a couple of questions. We might lose a couple attendants, but that's okay. For everyone who is
Okay.
still here, thank you so much for attending today. So to start with a couple of questions, Taryn is wondering if you have any information on vendors to work with to upgrade housing. They feel like they're having some trouble finding housing that match the guidelines.
Hmm. That's a great question. And to the best of my knowledge, there aren't a lot of options out there. Um, when it comes to like rabbit specific housing. There are some housing units that have been built for like pet stores, and not all of those meet our guideline requirements. So most folks find that they're retrofitting spaces or building spaces that they already have. So like flexible rooms type spaces. If the sound and location can is conducive, like old group housing settings for cats or even kennels for dogs can be great options because those are often bigger spaces and allow for the type of sanitation that we need. Um, but I'm happy to touch base off this call with if my information's provided at the beginning of this PowerPoint, and like I said, I'll be sharing a PDF um, to hopefully help. Um, with that. So anybody can reach out to me and we can maybe kind of troubleshoot the ability to find um, some commercially made housing options.
Great. So we have two questions. They're slightly different, but they both pertain to like recommendations for covers to put over indoor enclosures. The one is you answered a little bit about like using a sheet for rabbits who jump.
Mhm.
We were just curious if there were any other recommendations you had.
Well, so if you're building an enclosure, then a solid um, kind of ceiling typing, cover can be great. Um, and again, it doesn't necessarily have to be covered if your wall height will keep escapees from escaping. And that's important, obviously from an escape standpoint, but also from just a potential for injury standpoint. So for most rabbits, as long as they don't have platforms that are close enough to the edge to allow them to jump off, about 4.1 feet should help keep rabbits from escaping. Um, but even something as simple as some kind of like wire mesh or something over the kennel or something that can be folded back and forth so that you can get into the enclosure um, can do pretty well. Most folks have found that like rabbits aren't pushing the limit of that barrier the same way that some other species might like really try to escape out of there. Um, so because they're a prey species, they're just less likely to um, really try to take those sheets or something like that off. I don't know if that really fully answers the question, but
Yeah, I think so. Jessica, let us know if you have more on that. The follow-up to that was also like rabbits that are housed in enclosed like in exercise pens. Should they be covered with some kind of sheet or barrier, not so much for jumping out, but for their own feeling of safety, or do you think a hidey box in the enclosure would suffice?
yeah, that's a great question. And it's kind of on a spectrum, right? So, if we, for exercise spaces or for the primary enclosure, if we're providing lots of opportunities, lots of choice, again, for them to go, hide, find a dark space, get away, then probably putting an overall cover over the top becomes exponentially less important. Um, but let's say your exercise spaces, for whatever reason, maybe you're cycling a lot of animals through there and you have sanitation concerns, you might consider kind of having a roof or even some solid walls that just give that much more um, feeling of security.
Fantastic. Last question that I have here, and maybe for the sake of time, you can bullet point for us a little bit. Tiffany is wondering if you could go over some more specific health benefits to adequate housing. They feel like they're having a difficult time convincing not only their adopters, but sometimes even their co-staff members as to why these matter.
Yeah, and this is a plug for the document. Like that one, I think it starts with us reading the document, and then if we can share some information from the document with team members as well, it increases their that knowledge base that they'll draw from to understand how important it is. It's not just health benefits, for these animals, we really are, it's a goal for us to at least get them to a kind of a neutral state and hopefully into a positive state of being. Um, it's as much about like these animals, if they don't have what they need through their housing, through the resources we provide them, they can really experience some detrimental health, mental health, behavioral health, and physical health effects. So, like I talked about, there are GI side effects to not having enough room to run. It contributes to stasis in the GI tract. There are cardiovascular um, detrimental effects. There are neurologic detrimental effects. There are increased risks of infectious disease. And we go into a lot of detail about that in the guidelines. And similar to the way that we regard dogs and cats, I think if we can help folks say or understand, like, think about the things you know about housing animals in shelters. Think about the things you know about housing dogs and cats in shelters and how when they don't have what they need, how detrimental that can be to them. The same is applicable for rabbits.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Sarah. That was really fantastic and informational. If
Oh,
folks have not read these
thank you.
guidelines already, they are lengthy, but worth the read. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. Definitely look out for our future webinars. Again, our next one is on February 11th. Kind of riding off this topic of guidelines for small animals and medical in the shelter setting. Also, keep in mind that our training conference is coming up in March, the 16th to the 18th. That'll be in Portland. Thanks, everybody, so much again, and we'll see you all soon.